Hey guys, okay, today we're talking about debt. So most of us take on debt at some point throughout our lives, but for the vast majority of Australians, developing a good understanding of debt is really something that's lacking in their financial education. So with debt, we have good debt and bad debt. So good debt is associated with purchases where we're trying to acquire a capital asset such as an investment property or a portfolio of shares. Bad debt, on the other hand, is debt that we come into as a consequence of really bringing forward our future spending to the present moment. It's buying a holiday, potentially paying for a wedding, spending money on furniture. It's coming into debt without actually coming into a corresponding valuable capital asset that we expect to increase in value over time. Now, when we look at good and bad debt, there's also a debt hierarchy. So, when we talk about a debt hierarchy, what we're really talking about is how expensive is this debt? What will this debt actually cost me? So, at the very top of that hierarchy might be something like credit card debt or unsecured business debt. Now, these debts can range between 15, 16, 20, 25%. Now, the actual cash flow implication of a debt that's 20% is significantly more than something like a home loan, which might be 4, 5, or 6%. So the debts in order of hierarchy might be something like unsecured business loan debt, credit card debt, unsecured personal loan debt, then maybe a car loan that's secured against the actual car itself. And then the cheapest form of debt that you'll typically find is a home loan or an investment loan for a property. So that debt ranges between maybe 25 to 6% presently. Now, whenever you're in a position where you have debt, you want to try and optimize the debt that you have. So if you've got a broad array of assets and a broad array of debts, it probably wouldn't make sense to keep holding on to a debt that's charging you 12% per annum when you might have equity available and the capacity to refinance that debt at 5 or 6%. Just doing that, you're going to effectively halve the interest that you pay on that debt and therefore the long-term cash flow implication of that debt. Now, the next thing to understand as well is the difference between deductible and non-deductible debt. Now, this is a really big one, right? So deductible debt is debt which is accrued or which is incurred as a consequence of the purchase of an income-producing asset or an asset that we have a high confidence will produce income even if it's not producing income immediately. Non-deductible debt is debt that's incurred as a consequence of purchasing something that isn't an asset that's going to yield an income. So the most common forms of deductible and non-deductible debt that people in general come across would be something like a home loan would be non-deductible and an investment property loan would be deductible. When we're looking at these debts, the first thing that we have to realize is that the status of this deductibility has a significant impact on the actual cash flow cost of the debt. If we start with the deductible debt, if we were to have $100,000 worth of debt, and that debt was, let's say, 6% per annum in terms of the interest rate cost. Now, that means that $100,000 is costing me 6% per annum, and I'm paying a $6,000 per annum interest fee. Now, if that debt is tax deductible, and let's assume that the average tax rate that I'm on is 40%, well, that $6,000 is going to effectively be a tax deduction. At a $6,000 rate with a 40% tax rate, that means that $2,400 per annum of that $6,000 is actually going to come back to me from the government in the form of a tax return. That brings my net holding cost on that debt from $6,000 to $3,600. If we then go to the non-deductible debt with the exact same scenario, all of the steps are the same. We still get to the $6,000 per annum cost, but the final step of actually getting that government rebate to the value of $2,400 doesn't happen. So what happens is I'm effectively covering the entire cost of that debt by myself. So what you can then say is for a given interest rate, if your deductible and your non-deductible debt were the same cost from an interest perspective, the deductible debt would be cheaper from a net of tax perspective. And therefore, one of the things that we want to try and optimize for is decreasing non-deductible debt where possible and maintaining a very healthy level of tax deductible debt. So if you're in a situation, for example, where you had a lot of home loan debt, maybe you had $1 million worth of home loan debt, and you had the opportunity to offset the home loan debt or potentially offset the investment loan debt, and you're better served by actually offsetting the home loan debt. Even if the interest rate on the investment loan debt was a little bit higher, depending on your marginal tax rate, you might still be better off actually offsetting the non-deductible debt and leaving the investment debt uncovered. Now, once we understand this concept of deductible and non-deductible debt, it's very important to start to put into place strategies to pay down or offset non-deductible debt whilst maximizing and preserving tax-deductible debt, okay? So an example of this would be the following scenario. If I've got $1 million worth of home loan debt and my property is worth $2 million, just for really, really easy maths. Now, I've got $1 million worth of equity in that property. If I were to then go and take $100,000 and invest in a portfolio of shares, or take $100,000 and put down a deposit for an investment property, I've taken $100,000 of cash off of my non-deductible debt and in effect decrease the amount of borrowing that I'll have in the acquisition of that new asset by that $100,000. So if we say I've taken $100,000 to purchase an investment property for $500,000, I'll have about $400,000 worth of debt associated with that property and $100,000 worth of cash that are contributed to it. On the other side, I've uncovered $100,000 worth of non-deductible debt. So in this example, it's very likely that a better way to have actually facilitated the purchase of this property would have been an equity release, leaving the cash against the non-deductible debt and utilizing the equity in the principal residence to facilitate the purchase of the investment property without actually utilizing any cash whatsoever. If we look at that scenario, you've still got the $100,000 worth of cash sitting across and against the non-deductible debt, but you've got $100,000 worth of tax-deductible debt, which has now been associated and originated in the purchase of this income-bearing asset. So your net debt level is no different. In one scenario, uncovered $100,000 more of non-deductible debt, and in the scenario where you've actually executed the equity release, you've originated $100,000 worth of tax-deductible debt. So at a 6% interest rate, that means that the second scenario is actually generating $6,000 a year more in tax deductions for you. If you hold this property for a period of 30 years at a 6% interest rate, that's $180,000 worth of tax deductions simply because you structured your debt correctly. Now, another thing to be very, very conscious of is actually debt mapping. So a big mistake that people make is they only facilitate debt analysis and they only execute it on a single layer, on a single slice of time. So they might look at their current situation and they might say, okay, I currently have a principal residence and it's, I've got $600,000 worth of debt on it. And I want to, purchase an investment property in the future, or maybe I'm going to be in a position where I'll make this property into an investment property and buy a larger house in the future. So because this debt is non-deductible, I'm just going to try and pay off as much of this debt as possible. Now, from one perspective, this is correct. You have non-deductible debt and you're offsetting it or paying it down as quickly as you can. From another perspective, what this person has forgotten to do is consider not just the present moment from the perspective of the deductibility and the non-deductibility of the debt, but they failed to debt map. Debt mapping is actually taking into consideration not just the present moment, but the entire life cycle of the debt and coming to an understanding of whether that debt may be presently deductible, non-deductible, and then the potential changes in that debt over time to develop a plan on whether it's worth preserving or actually paying down that debt. So if we go back to that scenario and you've got a principal residence that you live in, potentially one day it may be the case that you move out of that property and retain it as an investment property. So if you've paid down a large portion of the debt, thinking it's non-deductible debt, but then move out of the property and make it into an investment property, what you've effectively done is you've cost yourself the tax deductions that you could accrue on that property in the future. So if in one scenario, someone has debt mapped and they've taken into consideration the future state of that debt, what they may want to implement is a strategy where rather than paying down the debt, they concentrate on utilizing an offset account. An offset account will effectively decrease the interest paid on that loan by the value of whatever the value in the offset account is. Each dollar in the offset account will marry up to a dollar of the loan, and that particular dollar's worth of interest charged will not be charged on the account. So if you have a $1 million loan and $400,000 in the offset account, you'll effectively only be charged on $600,000. Now, in that scenario, imagine someone had put $200,000 in the Austin account and move it from the original principal residence, which has now become an investment property, over to the new principal residence. They will cover up $200,000 worth of non-deductible debt and uncover $200,000 worth of tax-deductible debt, which at a 6% interest rate will result in an extra $12,000 a year in tax deductions. So really getting an understanding of how to deal with debt, how to optimize debt and prioritize debt is fundamental. So going back to basics, we need to understand good debt versus bad debt. We need to understand deductible debt versus non-deductible debt. We need to understand there's a debt hierarchy, effectively triaging debt across different interest rates. And then we need to debt map. If you do these things, you'll be leagues ahead of 95% of the population, and it's likely that you'll have cheaper debt structured in a more cash effective way that's more tax effective over the short and long term. Thanks for staying with us for Debt 101. If you've got any questions or comments, leave it below and we'll do more videos in line with what you guys request. Thank you.